Hey guys, welcome to dailyfantasycafe.com here. I'm Rob Mazaika and I'm here with Jason Gobo. And this is the NFL targets and touches report for week 5. Week 4 was a very interesting week. Not a lot of high scores winning tournaments. Again, it's been pretty tough to predict the chalk. You have guys like Nuke Hawkins, who we thought were going to be like 30% owned in some tournaments, and he was like, I don't know, 20%. And it's just been a tough NFL season so far to predict ownership. And really, just in general, it's been a lower scoring season. But in week 5, we have some interesting spots where we want to look at for these targets and touches. We have some injuries that we're going to talk about. But we're going to start first with the Giants passing game. Odell Beckham, he got pretty banged up last week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But this game is a 44.5 over-under. The Giants are 3-point home favorites against the Chargers, and they have 24 implied points. And with Beckham banged up, do you think he's going to get less targets?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think the finger is really all that much of an issue. I think he'll play through it. I know week 2, obviously, he was banged up and he was just kind of more of a decoy because that was his lowest target game in quite some time. But then since then, I mean, Beckham's been 15 and 13 targets. So I think he's still obviously, fine for this week. Just obviously keep an eye on it going forward. But as far as the other guys go, Brandon Marshall, he's been getting about, 7 targets a game. He hasn't really been all that productive. Evan Ingram's actually the guy that I'm looking at quite a bit this week. 7, 7, and 11 targets over his last 3. He's tied in targets with Gronk. He's caught 19 receptions this year for 200 yards and 1 touchdown. And Chargers 31st in DVOA against tight ends this season. He's actually one of my favorite plays this week. So I think outside of OBJ, Ingram's going to be where we look. But I wouldn't actually be surprised if Sterling Shepard gets a little bit of look for me this week because you look at Chargers, 11th most fantasy points allowed to wide receivers this year. They've given up touchdowns to Benny Fowler, Kenny Stills, and Albert Wilson this year. They've given up a lot of touchdowns to those secondary wide receivers because of the injuries to Jason Verrett. And Sterling Shepard's an interesting dart throw if you want to go that route in GPPs.
I like Ingram this week for sure. Evan Ingram. He's the guy who is one of the very few tight ends that gets consistent targets. We've been talking about it all season, where how it's very tough to fill the tight end position this year because you're either paying up for Gronk or you're just punting the position as a whole and hoping you get the targets from these lower end guys. So Ingram, he's at that price range on FanDuel at 5,400, which is just perfect for him. Last 2 games, he had 11 targets and 7 targets. I think you could lock him in for at least 7 targets in this game against the Chargers. Like you said, they're one of the worst teams against the tight ends this season. Even though they haven't given up a ton of fantasy points to tight ends, their DVOA says otherwise, and that's typically the stat we'll go by when evaluating a matchup. But definitely Evan Ingram for me, just in general, even if Beckham does get less targets, I mean, it's just he's in that tough position to fill.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, you look at this offense. I mean, they're throwing the ball a ton this year. They're second in the league in passing attempts per game. They have such little rushing game where these guys are all kind of getting consistently 7+ targets. Really, all 4 of them.
Yeah, they are. And now we're just going to move on here to this next game here, this Dolphins and Titans game. There's no line on it yet as of Tuesday because of, I think, the health of Marcus Mariota, depending on if he's going to play or if he's going to be limited or who knows. But it's an excellent matchup for the Dolphins here. I know how bad the Dolphins is. Got destroyed by the Jets, got destroyed by the Saints. But in this matchup where we just saw Deshaun Watson go for 5 touchdowns against the Titans here. Titans are the second worst team in the league against quarterbacks and giving them fantasy points, speaking FanDuel-wise. And Jay Cutler, he has a lot of guys he can throw to, but he pretty much just locks in on a couple guys.
Yeah, there's definitely 2 that I'm looking for this year or this week. I just think overall, like you said, we looked at the Jets, and that was a big letdown. We looked at New Orleans. Obviously, that game was in London. I didn't have any exposure to it, given I didn't play those slates. But it was just a letdown basically by Miami over the last few weeks. And I'm curious to see how many people go back to the well here in such a good spot because, like you said, Tennessee's just been awful against opposing passing games. So when we look at Jarvis Landry, Devontae Parker, obviously Landry's seen 31% of the targets. He's caught 79% of them this year. Parker, 29 targets, 65% catch rate. Parker, I think, has obviously the higher touchdown upside, but Landry's useful on those PPR sites. Parker's 20th in the league in ADOT this year, 15.4 yards, averaging about 77 receiving yards per game. I like Parker a lot on FanDuel this week. They priced Parker up quite a bit on DK. He's averaging 9 targets per game this year. And you just kind of look, I mean, him and Landry are the guys Kenny Stills, he's nothing more than a home run threat. He's getting about 4 to 5 targets per game. Julius Thomas is one of the lowest ADOTs among tight ends. He's just not an efficient route runner. A high upside guy at this point. So for me, Landry, Parker are the guys this week. I think you can really attack this Tennessee secondary, even with Cutler throwing him too. I'm willing to go down this road one more time.
I know the feeling, man. I'm writing up Jay Cutler as a GPP play this week, and I just want to throw up every time I think about it. But looking at his options here, you have Landry and Parker. Landry, I really don't have much interest, especially on FanDuel. He's 6,600, and he might get, he could get you 10 catches in the game, but what's he going to do? Get 2 or 3 yards per catch? I just don't really see the upside with him unless he somehow breaks out one of those really long runs on these 2-yard catches. So Parker, the guys on FanDuel who we're really interested in. I think he's going to be very popular, especially in this matchup against Tennessee. And after what Hopkins just did to them last week, Parker kind of plays the same role as Hopkins in this Dolphins receivers. And Cutler, he really locks in on his X receiver, and that's who Parker is. So I think Parker's the guy just in all formats this week.
Yeah, I'm with you. Super cheap on FanDuel, and he's been the only one who's really consistently hit value of this offense.
Yeah, he really is. It's just because he's the big receiver on the team. Landry just gets those short passes, and Parker's a downfield threat. And so we're going to move on here to another passing game. The Philadelphia Eagles, they're at home against the Cardinals, and over-under of 45, and the Eagles are 6.5-point favorites. And they actually have the third highest implied total on the slate at 25.8. So that was kind of a shock to me when I first saw it, but it kind of makes sense with the way the Cardinals have been playing.
Yeah, they haven't played good. May know this West Coast teams that travel east, they usually drop off in defensive and offensive production. Carson Palmer is always good for a pick or two as well to get Carson Wentz in a good spot. But when you look at targets here, something to note with Arizona is Patrick Peterson's one of the shutdown corners in that game. He really does limit opposing wide receiver ones, which that is, Alshon Jeffrey this week. When you look at things, 3.5 passing attempts per game to wide receiver ones this year, 6.9 go to wide receiver twos, 7.3 to other wide receivers, 4.8 to tight ends, and 7.5 to running backs. Jeffrey's averaging 8.5 targets per game this year. I think we might see actually a little bit of a pickup for guys like Nelson Aguilar, Torrey Smith, Zach Ertz, Ertz is, one of the consistent tight ends for targets, but, if this kind of trend continues, we might see, those guys pick up a little more slack. And I think with, the way Carson Wentz is throwing the ball this year and really Philly, throwing 37 times per game, I don't mind taking some shots with these other guys. But for me, Ertz is always the guy that I'm looking at in this passing game, especially with Jeffrey seeing Patrick Peterson. But Nelson Aguilar is actually a sneaky GPP play if you want him as a dart throw.
Nelson Aguilar, the guy who couldn't catch a ball at all last season. But this year, he's actually looked pretty good for this Eagles offense. He's playing confidently. He's catching balls that are thrown to him. He's not really getting a lot of targets, 3 or 4 targets a game, with the exception of the first game against Washington. But he's in a good spot, especially because Alshon's going to have to deal with Peterson. And Ertz is actually in kind of a tough spot, but the volume's just going to be there enough for him to really succeed. His price is going up to 6,600 on FanDuel, but when you're getting at least 10 points at a tight end position, you really can't go wrong there, even with the targets and the tough matchup.
Oh, you can't. And oddly enough, Aguilar leads the Eagles in red zone targets for some reason. That's not a trend that'll continue, but it's just something to note.
Yeah, but do you have any interest in like Torrey Smith maybe too?
I don't think so. Obviously he's more of a downfield guy, but I think Aguilar is still the one for me at his price. I think Smith is a guy that I'm just I don't see much fantasy use for him.
Yeah, that makes sense. He's just really he used to be good. He was a college standout, but not here, not in the NFL. No. We're going to move on here to another injury situation. The Seattle Seahawks running game. Chris Carson, he was the chalk last week on FanDuel. He wasn't available on DraftKings. Not going to comment on that. But we're really looking towards the Seattle running game and where these touches are going to get. They have a 22.5 implied total, and they're actually 2-point underdogs at the Rams this week.
Yeah, I think we've talked about the Seattle running game already this year, like back in week 2 against San Francisco, and this is a tremendous matchup here. You look at the Rams; they've given up the most fantasy points per game to opposing backs this season. 560 yards on the ground, 174 yards through the air, 7 total touchdowns. Only the Chargers and Jaguars have a lot more yards to opposing backs this year. When we look at things, last week Thomas Rawls was a healthy scratch because of Carson. Carson's obviously out for the year now. We saw Eddie Lacy and J.D. McKissick, come in and provide some relief in the fourth quarter. But C.J. Prosise back this week. Thomas Rawls is going to be activated. Pete Carroll already said that Rawls is going to be a guy who they kind of plug back into that RB1 spot, but it's not something that you can just automatically trust. Especially if Rawls gets off to a struggling start, I would not be surprised to see Carroll go for Lacy, McKissic, Prosise, and kind of work by committee, because you really can't trust this rotation right now. And I think Rawls is an interesting GPP guy because he is super cheap. And really outside of Bell this week, I'm not in love with a ton of running backs, but I mean, it's a kind of a high risk, high reward at this point. It's more of like a 4 p.m. only slate if you're going that route.
Yeah, I agree there. I mean, Thomas Rawls at 4,800 on FanDuel. I remember last year we were paying a premium for him at some points, but in his one outing this season, he had his 5 rush attempts for 4 yards. So I mean, that's not very reassuring. But with the way this Rams defense has been against the running game, it's just an excellent spot. It's just a matter of, can you guess the right running back who's going to break out the run? That's pretty much it. So for me personally, I don't feel comfortable going to any of these guys. McKissic coming off his huge game, I think people are going to flock to that, even though it's kind of a fluke with his 2 touchdowns and 19 fantasy points on FanDuel. It's kind of inflated. So it's really, for me personally, it's a stay away spot.
Yeah, I think for the most part it is too. I mean, I don't see the need to use McKissic, especially with Prosise back, who they kind of are using a similar role. Rawls, once again, I mean, this is, if he's struggling, he has 11 yards on 8 attempts, and we see some Lacy who runs pretty well. Rawls isn't really going to be getting back on the field, and especially if Seattle has to chase this one from a little bit. I mean, like you said, the Rams are favorites. They're playing well. Seattle really hasn't been a consistent team this year.
Yeah, but can you see a case where Seattle gets down maybe 10 points or a touchdown or so, and they start using a guy out of the backfield to throw to? Do you think who's going to get those? McKissic, Rawls?
I mean, if we're looking larger sample size, Prosise has always been that guy, but he's always been injured.
Yeah.
If they're going to ride the hot hand and McKissic gets that look, I mean, I can see that. That's probably the area I definitely don't want to go down, is McKissic or Prosise. I think I'd rather try and decide between Rawls and Lacy.
Yeah, it's just a scary situation as a whole. So, I mean, our recommendation, it seems to be, is just to stay away in general.
Yep.
But that's going to wrap things up for us today on the Target and Touches report for Week 5. I'm Rob Mazika, and this is Jason Gobo. And good luck this week. And go check out our articles and our optimizer on dailyfantasycafe.com.